Good afternoon, everybody. How are you all doing? My name is Manju Pendekar. I'm the Dean of Dorothy F. Schmidt College of Arts and Letters. On behalf of the students, faculty, and staff of my college, I'm extending a warm welcome to all of you and to His Excellency, Ambassador Thomas Pickering. Now, my distinguished colleagues in the Department of History organize many high-profile events every year to enhance the intellectual life of our university and to serve our students and the community in South Florida. We all believe and consider the Department of History as a jewel in the crown of our college, and we're very, very proud of the faculty and the students. I'm grateful for their energy and commitment to enhancing the university's life. Now, you'll be pleased to know that we have many alumni and supporters sitting in the audience, and without their backing, I can tell you some of these activities cannot simply happen. In that regard, I'm particularly grateful to Charna Larkin and her family for the continued and generous support of the Department of History and the university. Charna, thank you. Now, to introduce the distinguished speaker, let me invite Professor Ken Osgood to come to the podium. Ken, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dean Pendekar, for that very nice welcome. We are grateful for your support for this symposium and for your efforts to enhance the quality of learning at FAU. Now, before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to make a few quick announcements and to acknowledge the many people who work to make this event possible. And I'd like to first echo Dean Pendekar's thanks to the Larkin family. This symposium is a remarkable testimony to their generosity and to their vision. I'm so very thankful they chose the FAU History Department as the vehicle for honoring the memory of Alan Larkin, by all accounts a marvelous man from a marvelous family. And I know Charna Larkin is here today, and I'd like to say thank you. I would also like to say a special word of thanks to someone who is not here. Skip Orr graduated from FAU's Department of History many years ago, long before I was here. But he since went on to become president of Boeing Japan, where he worked for our speaker today. He played a key role in helping me bring Ambassador Pickering to FAU, and for that I am grateful. I'm also indebted to a number of people who work tirelessly behind the scenes. I'd especially like to acknowledge the History Department's Executive Secretary, Zella Lynn, my remarkable assistant, Dan Calderon, as well as Nicole Jacobson, Polly Burks, Lori Carney, Audra Vaz, and my graduate students who I volunteered to serve as ushers today. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming today. It's so wonderful to see so many students, as well as members of the community and faculty here. I'm also deeply honored to be able to introduce our speaker, a man described by Time magazine as the, quote, five-star general of the diplomatic corps. Ambassador Pickering has earned that phrase. He is perhaps the most distinguished and respected career diplomat in the U.S. Department of State. He holds the rank of Career Ambassador, the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Service. Over his 4-some-odd decades in the Foreign Service, he has served as ambassador to 6 countries: Jordan, Nigeria, El Salvador, Israel, India, and Russia. He also served as ambassador to the United Nations. He was appointed to that position by the first President Bush at a very critical time during the first war with Iraq. As UN ambassador, he helped lead the Security Council's response to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. At the end of his term in the UN, the New York Times described him, and again I quote, as arguably the best ever U.S. representative to that body. Over his remarkable career, Ambassador Pickering has served as special assistant to 2 Secretaries of State, William Rogers and the legendary Henry Kissinger. During the administration of Bill Clinton, he also served as Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the number 3 spot in the State Department. I also learned that Ambassador Pickering has a distant cousin who was another notable public servant. His ancestor, Timothy Pickering, served as Secretary of War and Secretary of State under President George Washington and John Adams. He also served as the second Postmaster General of the United States, and here he and I recently discovered, have something in common, as the first Postmaster General was Samuel Osgood, my great, et cetera, grandfather. Upon retiring from the Foreign Service, Ambassador Pickering became a senior vice president for Boeing. Today, he serves as chairman or on the board of numerous organizations that help shape the debate about modern international relations, including the International Crisis Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, the American Academy of Diplomacy, the American Iranian Council, and the nonpartisan Project on National Security Reform. Ambassador Pickering speaks 7 languages, and he has received 12 honorary degrees. But I'm perhaps most excited to report, as a historian, that our most distinguished and accomplished guest was a history major at Bowdoin College in Maine. And so now I finally have an answer to that question that dogs me. My students keep pestering me with, what can I do with a history degree? So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Thomas Pickering.
Thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm welcome, for finding an opportunity to come in out of the sunshine today. I'm delighted to be here and particularly pleased and honored to be part of the Larkin lectureship. Thank you very much, Mrs. Larkin and family, for your generosity to the university that makes my presence here today possible. Thank you too, Ken, for your very, very laudatory and pleasant introduction. I have a deep sense that the famous old story is still true. My father really would have appreciated that introduction, and my mother would have believed it all. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about a subject or a series of subjects that's intrigued me for a very long period of time. I had the opportunity to serve twice in the Middle East from 1974 until 1978. I was ambassador to Jordan, and then 7 years later, from 1985 until the end of 1988, I had the privilege of being ambassador to Israel. I was the first American, to my knowledge, to serve first in an Arab country and then in Israel. I don't know that anybody has ever done it the other way, and I consider myself a founding member of the Schizophrenics Club. Today, I want to discuss 3 closely interrelated subjects. I want to talk a little bit about the background for diplomacy and the Middle East in the second decade of the 21st century, much of which has to be contended with by the Obama administration. I then want to talk about a number of country-related issues, and then I want to do something in the course of that discussion which diplomats always try to shy away from, some suggestions for how we might find our way forward in some of the more difficult controversies and problems in this important area. First, let's look at some of the background. I think no administration, perhaps since Franklin Roosevelt or even Abraham Lincoln, has come to office with more problems on its agenda, both domestic and foreign. They are huge, and they are overloading in many ways, and in many ways they're closely intertwined. One only has to look at the fact that until a week ago, the Democrats and President Obama worked very hard to do 2 things at one time: pass health care legislation, and in the course of doing that, not to alienate that 60th senator who was critically important to get the bill through. And in many ways, because the Middle East is intensely of interest to the American public and the American Congress, It has meant that the course of events in the Middle East that we have had to pursue has had to be carefully calibrated, in my view, to assure that the domestic priorities also emerged as important parts of U.S. success. I think that it is interesting and important these days to note that over the last year and a half or 2 years, this country has come, I think, to a collective conclusion that force is no longer a real substitute for the application of diplomacy in resolving international problems. I think Iraq and our experience in Afghanistan have begun to show clearly that that's a very, very important home truth. No American diplomat would obviously ever wish to work in an environment where our superb military was not there, was not perceived, was not seen, and was not taken into account with the people with whom we are working, because it is an enormous part, along with our economic strength, of America's position in the world and our capacity to lead. So no one, I think, would say force for any reason at all needs to be discarded or not maintained, or indeed not be a central part of our national security policy. I would say also, increasingly, I think we're of a mind to believe that force is best used in defense, that wars of choice present very, very difficult conundra for us as we look ahead at them and decide whether, in fact, it is a wise thing to do. It has meant that increasingly there is an interest, not just in Washington, but I think across the board, in academia, in our public, in the press, and in the media, in diplomacy, which is a central focus of what I want to speak about today. So my feeling is that if there is a coming growth period in our national lives for diplomacy, it lies ahead of us. I had the honor to participate beginning a year ago in a privately funded study carried on by my colleagues and myself and a number of experts to take a look at what would actually be required in terms of personnel to put the State Department in a position to be able to address the critical issues of diplomacy in the coming decades. And we decided about a year ago that 5,000 new officer positions, more or less, would be required, and we said where the areas of emphasis ought to be in those positions. I'm happy to tell you that we have been more successful in our recommendations than any I've seen in recent years, and that already, in a combination of budgets from the last administration and the current administration, 3,300 of those 5,000 positions have been paid for. That's a remarkable step forward, and it's another indication of how important the public has taken and the Congress has taken this effort to move this question ahead. And so that's significant. Along with what I would call the national shift toward diplomacy and its importance has come as well another reexamination, the reexamination between whether we have a unilateral moment in American policy, security and foreign policy, or whether in fact we are, as many of us think, have been engaged with many countries around the world in trying to work out solutions to problems and that they play an essential role. If you define a unilateral moment as the capacity of the United States at any time, anywhere, to do in its own interest, without the help of others, what is necessary, then I don't believe we ever existed in a world where there was truly a unilateral moment. But I think even more now than before, as we look around the world, whether it is in Afghanistan, on Middle East peace, on dealing with the economic crisis, addressing the problems of development and growth and poverty, we are all very much engaged in a set of activities which diplomacy has to contend with, not just our bilateral relationships with many countries around the world, but a multiplicity of them, what we call multilateral relations, whether it is in something called the G20 or in NATO or the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund or so on. And I think that's another important change that has come about as we think about these issues and helps us, and indeed encourages us to think about those kinds of questions in terms of the diplomacy that will have to be pursued to resolve those issues. I think it is also increasingly important in a globalized world that we come to understand that many problems now affect many countries and are not uniquely those between, say, the U.S. and Russia or the U.S. and China. There are some, they're important, but they also have now become broader. So how to deal with climate change is an example of one of those problems. What to do about global health is one of those problems. What to do about arms control and disarmament is not uniquely anymore the preserve of one or two countries, but a considerable concern across a wide panoply of activities being conducted with many countries. And this is quite significant. It's what we as diplomats have come to call functional issues as opposed to bilateral issues that are becoming to predominate on the international scene and require us to be prepared to deal with those with the expertise and indeed the people who know and understand to be able to address those questions, and that's important. Increasingly, as we found in the economic crisis, what happens in the world of economics plays an ever more increasing role in national security questions and in our major foreign policy preoccupations. None of you have to be reminded of that. We have all seen the impact on our country. And then finally, I would say, as we think strategically about these sets of issues, it's probably wise for us to take our thinking a little bit beyond the old stovepipes of thoughts about these questions, looking at energy questions purely alone and not considering how they play out in dealing with climate change or how they will play out in dealing with environmental impacts. And the same, of course, is true about the subject that I'm going to speak about next, the Middle East. Middle Eastern issues are clearly interrelated, in some ways intertwined, as we'll see. They may have to be resolved in discrete packages, but they need to be thought about, in my view, strategically as having an interrelationship. And this is important for two things. One, synergies. The diplomat's old friend. If you can't solve an issue directly, can you find a way to bring something else into the mix which will help you leverage that question? And the second question, which is the opposite of synergies, and that is unexpected, unanticipated consequences. If you are thinking strategically, you are thinking about how what you do on problem X relates to the two or three closely interrelated issues that play a role there. So let me take that background and now slide over into talking about critical questions facing the administration in the Middle East and what we might be doing about those, how we might best move ahead to try to deal with them. And let me begin, as we used to say in the airplane industry, at 30,000 feet. The intertwining of these issues is important. It is not, in my view, true that were we to be able to solve Arab-Israeli peace, all Middle East issues would go away. But I do think that if you cast your mind at some of the problems we face in the world, particularly attitudes in the Muslim world, the resolution of that long-standing and difficult problem would have an important positive benefit as we go ahead. And I think the same can be said for the other major issues in the region. I like to think of the Middle East today as an extended definition, from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush. The three I-word countries and their problems, Israel and the Arab-Israeli peace processes, Iraq, Iran, and Pakistan and Afghanistan. And let me begin in the East and move to the West. And let me begin with Pakistan and Afghanistan, if I can. I've deliberately used the phrase twice, Pakistan and Afghanistan, because I think essentially, if we examine our national interests for more than a few seconds, we must know and understand that the most important part of this duality is Pakistan, a country with nuclear weapons, a country with weak democracy, if much, a country with an enormous influence of Islamic fundamentalism, a country geopolitically placed in a critical area of the world. Much of what we have been able and not been able to do in Afghanistan has depended upon our access to Afghanistan through Pakistan's geography, a country which is of itself of mixed mind about Afghanistan. It is not a secret any longer that the principal Pakistani intelligence agency remains, in the view of almost all experts, married to the notion that Afghanistan is a safe hinterland and backup area in the event there were any war between Pakistan and India, and as a result operate that way, and indeed seem to operate as if their allies, the Afghan Taliban, have nothing to do with the Pakistan Taliban, when indeed I believe the opposite is totally true. So how then should we be looking at Afghanistan, in my perspective? And what should we be doing about it? We have been through a long period of examination, of necessity, because the active fighting for the United States is in Afghanistan. It is assumed a kind of importance that is unavoidably, and I think legitimately correct for our national media and for our national attention. I do not believe, and I say this after considerable thought on argument and dispute, that the solution to Al-Qaeda is our ability to occupy territory and either control or drive them out of Afghanistan. I say that in all honesty because if that were the case, and that is the appropriate formula for dealing with Al-Qaeda, what do we do when Al-Qaeda, as it has the capacity to do, moves from Pakistan, where it's now headquartered, to Yemen, or Somalia, or Eritrea, or Sudan, or elsewhere, which is all very likely? Is the formula then to send 100,000 Americans and 50,000 Allied troops to deal with the problem? I believe we have been more successful in dealing with Al-Qaeda than we give ourselves credit for, by understanding that Al-Qaeda, like McDonald's, is a franchise organization. The headquarters is in Pakistan, but the delivery is by local groups, sometimes self-inducted, who are prepared to do what is necessary to, in effect, carry out their objectives and policies at a local level, and that the connections are loose, and indeed the security is very strong. But if you look, in fact, at our recent successes, and there have been some, in dealing with leadership quotient inside Al-Qaeda, why we have not yet got bin Laden or Zawahiri, his deputy, we have done a great deal in reducing their reach and their effectiveness. I would say far from perfect, as Detroit shows, but nevertheless important steps. I think that we should be in Afghanistan, and I think the President has chosen the right alternative, which I tend to term the least worst alternative for the next phase, because in fact it is important that Afghanistan not destabilize in any worse manner the situation in Pakistan. I also think that as a country that exercises leadership in the world, it is important for us, if we can do so, not to leave Afghanistan an awful lot worse than when we found it. On the other hand, I have to tell you, with relatives in the U.S. military, I have my doubts as to how many Americans should be sacrificed for that objective. I really do. My hope is that with the President's willingness to set a time target, which sends a message in very clear terms to Hamid Karzai and the Afghan government, and with our willingness to beef up security, but for a limited period of time, we can do the major thing that has to be done, which is to engage the Afghans in their own future. That has not been successful. And we have seen bad governance, corruption. We have seen betrayals. We have seen a drug culture which is growing out of sight. 95% of the world's opium-based illegal drugs come from Afghanistan now. We have a huge problem ahead. Even more, I think there is something out there that we haven't thought of, and it applies to both Afghanistan and in a different way to Iraq, and I'll speak about that in a moment. And that is basically engaging others in the international community, not just to join us in the security forces and in the fighting, but to become part of what I believe has to take place to give us a sense of stability and security for the longer term, a diplomatic future for Afghanistan. Some have suggested, and I certainly agree with this, that Afghanistan should be neutralized in whatever way we can do that, the way Switzerland is. Some have suggested that there needs to be a diplomatic definition of the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which has not at all been settled, and I think that's important. Even more, however, I believe there needs to be an international effort involving Afghanistan, its neighbors, and the principal players in the international community, perhaps the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, China and France and the US and Russia and the United Kingdom and Japan and perhaps India and others in working out not just the terms of Afghanistan neutrality, but supporting a governance relationship inside Afghanistan which can do better at delivering security, development, and change in Afghanistan. I do not hold out hope that Afghanistan will become a Swiss democracy. I believe that it will preeminently have to stay a federated state with much in the way of local governance. I believe that we should not set targets so high as they're unrealizable. And again, I believe that a firm date for moving out will help, not hurt, in dealing not just with the Afghan government, but with the Afghan Taliban, who we are now moving, and I applaud this, to try to open up diplomatic channels to see, in fact, whether, as they move ahead, they will take into account the notion that we have an opportunity to improve the performance of Afghans who are not Talibans. And while the Taliban are frequently saying, you have the watch, but we have the time, we should say back, you may have the time, but we believe we have the future. If we don't have the future, then we don't have an exit strategy. And that's why what the President has done, in my view, is important. Pakistan is much harder to deal with. I will say this. For good or ill, and I think it's for good, the Pakistanis will have to resolve their own problems by themselves. We can help. But the notion that the U.S. should be present on the ground is anathema to Pakistanis, and in my view should be widely welcomed and wildly welcomed by the United States. We can help with technology, we can help with intelligence, we can help with funding where that's necessary. The Pakistanis, until 12 months ago, were totally mesmerized by the notion that the only security threat to them came from India. They suddenly realized that they had an internal problem, and they are now awakening to it. Pakistan has a very weak democracy. Its 2 political parties have no programs except the perpetuation of their own leadership in power. Its 3rd political party is the army, which is governed perhaps in recent years more often than the political parties. These are tremendously difficult challenges. They will not be easy to take on. The good news is that the army leadership does not seem interested in assuming a political mantle. And the bad news is that those who have political leadership in mind do not have, in my view, the capacity to match what the army brings to the field in security strength with the decisiveness and indeed the political judgment necessary to move ahead. We play in this diplomacy with many of the cards that were given. We have, with others, to mobilize our efforts to help the Pakistanis gradually improve in the areas where they have now awakened to the need to help to preserve the future of their own country. Let me move a little bit to the west, to Iran. Iran, for the United States, is of interest for two or three very important reasons. One is that, for all intents and purposes, and I accept this, it appears to be moving in a nuclear program which will give it the opportunity to make nuclear weapons. And that's something that we, I think, universally believe would be a very adverse development, not just because we distrust Iranian leadership, but because it would engender similar activities in places like Turkey and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and so on. And the larger number of people who have nuclear weapons, particularly in a volatile area of the Middle East, the more likely they are to lose control of those weapons on the one hand, or use them by accident or miscalculation on the other, which would have its own horrendous series of consequences. Secondly, Iran, for good or ill, is destined to be a significant player in the entire Middle East and beyond because of its size, its economy, and some of its strengths. And thirdly, because it represents, in a world where energy is increasingly important, a significant producer of petroleum and gas for the world at large. The United States has focused heavily on the nuclear question, as it should. But my feeling is that one of the things that we can do to expand our reach to Iran is also to open the door more positively and more publicly to our willingness to talk to Iran about other issues in the area, including Afghanistan and Iraq, where they could have either a malevolent or a positive influence, depending upon our diplomacy and its persuasive capacities. With respect to the nuclear issue, we have seen Iran, before the June 12, 2009 elections, go from a country which had a serious case of hubris about its own future to one, within days following the election, that was distraught, conflicted, and chagrined and embarrassed by its effort to use Jersey City politics to decide who would be the president of the country. I happen to come from New Jersey, so I know what that means. The rest of you can find out. This has meant that the opening which the Obama administration has made with serious intent to Iran has been stymied because it has gotten tied up in Iranian internal politics. A proposal made on the 1st of October on the nuclear question, which would have opened the door to further negotiations and indeed some progress, in an interesting way was championed, of all things, by President Ahmadinejad, our arch villain, perhaps because he thought it was time to get back into the good graces of his people and the world by championing something that was reasonable for Iran. And of course, much to our embarrassment, the people who were denied the election by Jersey City machinations came out against the proposal because they felt it was time to recover their strength inside Iran by wrapping themselves in the flag of nationalism. It meant, in effect, that we've gone through a topsy-turvy period. Where this can go, nobody knows. But for several years, I have felt that the most important thing for us on the nuclear side in Iran is to get continuing, ongoing, expansive international inspection so we know what's happening, and we can show the rest of the world that even if we know something is happening through our intelligence, that there is also a public revelation of that which will help build strength to deter Iran from going further, because the one thing I think the Iranians are careful about is what we have all come to call the decent opinion of mankind on their questions, and that's significant. And so while they disparage the U.S. and attempt to isolate the U.S., they are very much attuned to what the rest of the world thinks. Secondly, I believe it's important enough to get this kind of inspection and monitoring that I would, for one, be willing to pay for that by allowing multilaterally operated and managed enrichment inside Iran, limited to what's needed for its civilian program. In large measure because by denying that enrichment, we deny the Iranians nothing that they don't already have now. They know how to do it. But we do have, in fact, an opportunity to achieve, in my view, a more useful long-term objective in knowing clearly on a regular basis by being able to visit anywhere in Iran and look at any site what's happening. Whether we will get there or not, I do not know, but it is certainly, in my view, important to think clearly about this in the time ahead. Iran, too, in my view, will find it easier to open up the idea of having conversations with the United States and others if, in fact, we can broaden the agenda beyond the nuclear question. And I'm hopeful that this has already begun quietly and will be continued. When Iran will move in this direction, nobody knows. Sanctions are coming along. Sanctions, in my view, are of limited usefulness. The more important thing that I believe can be useful is to play on this Iranian preoccupation that they do not want to be totally isolated from the rest of the international community, commercially, politically, economically, and in every other way. And that means our diplomacy is required to bring others into the effort to convey clearly to the Iranians that that's what their current policies are in danger of producing. I do not believe the use of force will be effective against Iran. I believe that two things are true about the use of force against Iran, whether it is Israel or the United States or the two of us together. We don't know where all the targets are, and we would probably have grave difficulty hitting all of the ones we know about, at least in a short period of time. And secondly, the capacity of the rest of the world, including the Islamic world, and the Iranians themselves to retaliate for what would be perceived by them as an unprovoked attack is very large. And so a process which is not designed, in my view, to be sure about what it can produce, but where there is high certainty of extreme negative results, is the kind of thing that you want to think several times about before launching. Let me next turn to Iraq. I believe the security situation, despite the recent wave of powerful bombings, has overall continued to improve. And while we have all argued, and I don't intend to argue the question of the wisdom of going in, I will just say the following about my views on that subject. I believe that the combat operation in 2003 was conducted with a high degree of professionalism and success. I believe that the diplomacy leading up to the combat operation and our activities following the combat operation to consolidate, rebuild, strengthen, support the Iraqi government that emerged were conducted with the opposite degree of success. Where we are now with Iraq is a pending election and a process of moving out. What I remain concerned about is that civil strife can be rekindled inside Iraq if we are not careful, and that there are several potential triggers for doing that. One of those is the fact that we have not yet achieved a solid consensus inside Iraq for majority rule backed up with full respect for minority rights. And we have not yet achieved in Iraq, and this is principally the Iraqis, a consensus on the division of the growing income from petroleum and gas sales around the world among the contending factors, contending parties contending provinces of Iraq in terms of how that considerable income gets used for the benefit of all Iraqis. These are major, difficult problems. In addition to that, as we look ahead, we face a Middle East and a Persian or Arab Gulf, depending upon your proclivities for the name, of great uncertainty in a regional sense. And so there are two outstanding issues, in my view, which call out again for the kind of general diplomacy which I described in a different context with respect to Afghanistan. There, I think it's extremely important to involve the neighbors, because if Iraq descends into greater civil strife, God forbid, I have no interest in seeing it happen, then each of those neighbors will become a partisan of one or a number of the factions inside Iraq. Certainly the Iranians with the Shia majority, the Saudis, and to some extent perhaps the Syrians and the Jordanians with the Sunni minority. And the Turks will not want to see an independent Kurdistan in Iraq emerge as the result of fighting. It is important, therefore, that we engage, in my view, in diplomatic efforts also to resolve among those contending players the issues that domestically give rise to potential for strife and regionally remain unresolved. Where does Iraq and the rest of the nations in that region sit with respect to cooperation, commerce, economic activity, oil production, and other arrangements? And here I am very much persuaded that the neighbors, if they become part of the process, will alone be necessary but not sufficient to resolve it, and that others around the world, including both Russia and China, who have a continuing interest in this part of the world and not necessarily a common one, will one way or another find it advantageous to ally themselves with one or another of the neighbors for narrow short-term advantage. And so we have to build a consensus among those players to have a diplomatic solution. One can look in the past at a number of successful efforts in that regard. I believe they're important, and I believe that it is significant that Iraq needs to know that the international community is of one with the correct solutions to that problem and prepared to support it, rather than to sit on the sidelines and watch it go down the drain again, as is my view could happen in the time ahead. And now let me turn for a few minutes to the longest standing, most difficult, trying, aggravating, frustrating set of questions we've had in the region. What to do about the differences between the Arabs and Israel, and how to move ahead with that kind of a peace process. I think that there are a couple of things that I begin with that are true. I think that, with all respect to both Israelis and to Palestinians, and Israelis and Syrians, I do not believe that on their own they are likely to get there. In that regard, despite the differences with the United States, it plays an important role. The United States is supplemented in this important role by something called the Quartet, which includes Russia and the European Union and the United Nations. That it may sound the height of overweening self-pride to say that we are the essential party, but if anyone is an essential party in making things happen, I believe we are. I think, secondly, premised on the first conclusion is the application of the principle of the bicycle. The principle of the bicycle is, if you're not riding forward, you're falling down. And I think that that's very important. There is a third principle that I think is also important, maybe it's what I call the optimistic principle, that the only thing harder than making peace itself is finding a way, finally, forever, and completely to abandon the process of searching for peace. And so if you take those three principles as the basis for looking at this question moving ahead, then I would say the following about recent developments. I have applauded with enthusiasm the position taken by the Obama administration that the settlements in occupied territory by Israelis are illegitimate. For years, there has been a legal opinion, never rewritten, in the United States that has said they are illegal. I don't know the differences between illegitimacy and illegality. I won't parse the question. But I have grave reservations about the notion that the problem can be solved by a perfect freeze by Israel on all aspects of settlement development. One, because there are, on the basis of what has already happened, some activities that will go forward inevitably. And secondly, because I fully believe, after my almost 4 years as ambassador to Israel some time ago, that it is not politically or perhaps even physically possible to stop building on some of those settlements. That's a hard thing to say, but I think it's true. And that finally, and most importantly, settlements have a principal impact on the border between the future Palestinian state and the current state of Israel. And that's where the effort, in my view, needs to go. And so I applaud the President's decision on the 22nd of September at the United Nations, after he met with Prime Minister Netanyahu and with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, to move to the more direct question of how can we get at the principal issues that divide the parties. I think that there are two big, difficult mountains to cross to get to Palestinian-Israeli peace. One is to get the leadership on both sides pulled together around the notion that they will have to make excruciatingly difficult compromises to get there. And the second is what will be the general outline of those compromises. The second is better known in all respects today than the first, in the sense that almost everybody who has spent more than a few minutes on the problem could probably tell you where the middle ground lies between the parties, the only basis for bringing them together. I'll talk about that just briefly in a minute. The first is even harder. The Israeli government is not well constituted to address this problem. It could be, but it is not yet. And the Palestinians are even worse shape because half of the Palestinian interest in Gaza is controlled by one party and the other half in the West Bank by another. And up until now, we have not been willing to encourage any kind of unity between the two. My feeling is that that has to come, and it will be difficult. And having watched and been in Israel as the ambassador when we first started to talk to the PLO, my recollection is that our vision then of the PLO is very little different than our vision today of Hamas. I have to say that in full recognition of what I believe to be the historical truth. I believe that over time, some Hamas leaders can be pulled in to an effective peace process, but it takes time and effort to make that happen. I don't believe that should wait for the peace process to start, but I don't think you can have a successful conclusion without incorporating both Gaza and the West Bank in the future Palestinian state together. Where could the deals be made? Well, I think that we all know and understand that the future Palestinian state should be demilitarized, that it would have to have effective intelligence and police forces to prevent attacks against Israel, that there would have to be some kind of a peacekeeping operation, perhaps led by the United States, maybe under NATO, perhaps with UN authority to protect against that. That Jerusalem, as terribly difficult as that is, would probably have to be arranged in a way that the Arab areas would be part of the future Palestine. The Jewish areas would remain part of the State of Israel. That on the question of refugees, certainly the majority of Palestinian refugees will probably be resettled either in the new Palestinian state or around the world. Whether that will be sufficient or not, I do not know, but it will have to be worked on. And there will have to be a fair and equal division of water, and my own sense is that probably significant investments in things like desalination for the whole region will have to take place and can be done to bring about a solution. These are important. My sense is that an early next step has to be for the United States and perhaps the Quartet to put forward what it considers to be an outline of the arrangements that have to be made to bring a peaceful compromise. Not all of the details, but enough to signal to each party what it is that they have in mind that will not work, if I could put it that way. An outline of what I consider to be those arrangements which are within the ballpark and those arrangements which are not within the ballpark. This will require an enormous amount of courage and a serious effort. Finally, I believe that peace can be made between Syria and Israel, that increasingly we see some attention being paid to that, that both parties know pretty much what the essential compromises will have to be, that it has always been my view that Israel will benefit by having two processes going at a time, because neither process on the Arab side will want to be last for fear, in fact, that it gets a worse deal than it can get if it goes early. But those are just some thoughts on a very, very difficult problem. Let me conclude by saying that this set of questions, perhaps, is the most difficult we have to deal with, or certainly rivals our efforts both domestically and internationally to find our way out of the economic crisis. It's going to consume a lot of our time and attention and perhaps our treasure. We do need, in my view, to move toward end games, particularly in the two hot wars that we're conducting, that will pull our people out with the best that we can do on a reasonable time scale to leave behind stability. And that it is my view very significantly, certainly in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and probably in Iraq, that we need to give more time and attention to the international diplomatic solutions that I've described in broad outline as ways to move ahead. I thank you for your time and attention. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and I understand we'll have now time for what is usually the most interesting part of these presentations, what it is you have to say to me. Thank you very much.